But there's a couple of other things about immersive audio that make it a little bit different. Um, Relationship between speakers and channels. It's a flexible format in that you can mix with, there's a minimum number of speakers, which we'll probably talk about later, but once you hit that minimum, you can really go up. The sky's the limit. So it's a pretty flexible format.
Okay. So do you think it's here to stay with us, or a bit more of a gimmick like 3D movies were? You remember those? They kind of came and went.
Yeah, I think the momentum is there for this to stick.
Okay.
First of all, you've got major companies that are supporting immersive audio. On the audio realm, more specifically on the technical side, you have Dolby, who is really pushing their Atmos format. But on the commercial side, Apple has really thrown their weight behind immersive audio. And when you have the biggest company in the world putting their weight behind something, it probably helps to solidify it.
Absolutely.
So right now, even for film, I would say immersive or Atmos mixing is, if not already, quickly becoming one of the dominant ways of mixing. And for music, it is becoming more and more important. So Apple Music right now is very strongly pushing people towards delivering a Dolby Atmos mix.
That's right, yeah.
You don't have to, but if you want your music kind of promoted and on the front page of Apple Music, if it's a big name release, they're basically requiring it.
Sure.
And there's a little bit of buzz about Spotify jumping into that game as well. So in the film world, it's pretty much already decided. Music world is very heavily going in that direction. I think you could argue that game audio has been immersive for a very long time. Game audio were the first ones to arrive at. Very true. The immersive nature of the audio can really help the player a lot more. Sure. You can react much better to a sound. If you're in a shooter or something and you hear a sound, footsteps behind you or above you, that's going to really influence how you're playing the game.
Yeah, you can get some good localization on your enemy, I guess. So
yeah,
right.
Yeah. So game audio's already been ahead of the curve.
Sure.
And then on the consumer end, it's just getting easier to listen to immersive audio. Right. If you think of the average new car, it's already got a ton of speakers in it.
Sure.
So all they have to do is add a couple more speakers, and then you can be listening to immersive content in your car. So some car manufacturers are already offering that as like an upgrade package when you buy the car. There are now immersive, in-ears. Apple has their AirPods that are not only capable of reproducing the immersive audio, but they do head tracking. So if you turn your head while you're listening to the song, the sound field of the music is going to shift along with your head. So yeah, from the professional end and the consumer end, it's really picking up steam, and I think it might be too far. It might be too far to go back.
So that's how consumers are really going to experience immersive audio, for example, in their cars or while playing games, or that's listening to music, and it's definitely here to stay. Then you're saying, so it seems that way.
Yeah. And I don't know that there's a future where everybody has Dolby Atmos home theater installed, where there are speakers on the ceiling and all around the room. That some people will, some audiophiles will have something like that, and that's available now. You can buy a consumer home theater receiver and set that all up in your living room if you want to. But yeah, I think for the majority of people, it's going to be in those environments where people are already consuming media in their earbuds and in their cars and stuff like that. So
a little bit more of an extension to that.
Yeah.
So it's interesting when you mention car audio, because there was a worry initially, like 5.1 audio in cars were going to be, because you're sitting to the left, and of course if you're in different other countries you could be sitting to the right, right? So in England, Japan, Australia, so if you're sitting to the left, are you really experiencing? I'm sure it's kind of guided that way a little bit, and then I presume that Dolby Atmos or immersive audio is going to be it's going to address things like that. Do you think?
Right. I would hope so. Because it's not as simple as stereo where you can just adjust the balance.
Right.
You adjust it, I'm on the left, so I'm going to turn up the right so it sounds more even.
Sure.
But one of the beautiful things about Atmos and why it's becoming the dominant immersive format is that it down mixes or decodes to other settings much more effectively. And I don't know exactly how it would work, but I would imagine that because of that, they can probably factor that into the equation and still get you a pretty, balanced, immersive image, even if you're sitting on one side of the car or the other.
That makes sense. Yeah. So I have. So is it possible to produce immersive content, on your headphones, for example?
Right, and this is probably going to be important to a lot of students because if Apple Logic, for example, supports Dolby Atmos mixing, but how many audio production students at home have a Dolby Atmos speaker set up in their home studio?
Right.
I mean, I don't even have a Dolby Atmos,
No.
and I have a pretty cool home studio. With that in mind, headphones are going to be a huge part of this. Especially as you're kind of dipping your toes into these immersive formats. I think it's possible to create the content on headphones. In my opinion, and this is just my opinion, I've heard people say otherwise, I find that headphones struggle to live up to the speakers. Working on a Dolby Atmos album last year, we kind of started to kind of pre-mix some stuff on headphones on the laptop.
Just to get a rough mix there.
Yeah, just to get a rough idea of, and then when we put it on the speakers, it was like, no, we got to undo all that.
Oh, how?
It was like, it was close, but it wasn't close enough.
Right.
But it's tricky territory though, because the vast majority of consumers will be consuming on headphones.
Absolutely, yes.
So maybe there is an argument for maybe you should mix on headphones because that's going to translate
straight to
the consumer.
Right.
For me, I'm an audio snob. I will always mix in the best format available. If I have a Dolby Atmos theatrical mix set up in a dub stage, that's what I'm going to mix in, and the consumer can just live with the repercussions of that. But but I'm a snob, and maybe there's a place for people in the industry that aren't as snobby thinking about these things.
So you say it is possible to listen back to that content on headphones. I remember a long time ago we had a lab here where we did just basically surround sound, and we did this in going through decoding. And basically to headphones, 5.1 surround and it was an interesting thing. It worked, but it kind of didn't. So I guess you're kind of looking at it the same way. The technology is not quite there yet to whereas you'd be happy to just say, hey, this mix is going to translate perfectly on these headphones. I'll just leave it be, right? So you just
and. I do believe though if you have a good mix that you've been monitoring on like a quality setup, let's say some high-end speakers that are actually an immersive format, I think it's much more likely to fold down to those other formats a little bit more accurately.
Sure.
And it's interesting that you mentioned like a 5.1 to stereo, because that really shows one of the problems traditionally with going from a high channel count down to a low channel count.
Right.
That 5.1 to stereo down mix is accomplished with a plugin, and the plugin's pretty stupid.
Yeah.
Like all it does is it takes the speakers that are behind you and it drops their volume by 3 decibels, and then it just puts them in the front speakers.
Yeah, folds into the front.
And then you may or may not have your LFE or your subwoofer channel get down mixed at all.
Right.
So that's always been a little wonky, but it was kind of the best we had.
Exactly, yeah.
But in these immersive formats, sounds that are moving around, they're not tied to a given speaker. Instead, they are tied to like an XYZ coordinate system. So every single sound, as you're panning it through space, it has 3 numbers that represent where it is, horizontally, vertically, and so on, front to back. Sure. And that is a much smarter translation.
Sure.
It's going to, whether you're going from Atmos down to 7.1 or 5.1 or stereo or binaural, it's going to do a much better job because it's being fed better information. It's not like this stupid passive process. It's much more active and more involved. And I think everybody can relate to this problem because, have you ever been watching a movie at home on your television and the dialogue is like way too quiet? Yeah. So you turn up the remote. Right. And it gets, the dialogue's loud, but then the music and the sound effects come in and it's way too loud and it knocks you out, and then you're riding the volume again, and then you're kind of up and down and up and down. Part of the reason that happens is it's a problem with the down mix. Right. You're talking about a film that was mixed, probably in a very large dubbing stage, in some sort of surround sound format that's been basically funneled down to come out of the tiny, junky little speakers in your TV set. Sure. So that's a very common problem, and when we have like tour groups on our dub stage here in campus, I always remember we had a nursing home come visit, and there's a bunch of little old ladies, and their first question, how come I can never understand my TV? Well, partially it might be your hearing, but also there is a legitimate problem when you're watching content that's been mixed in a more surround sound format, and it's getting mixed down to reproduce on a tiny little TV speaker. That's always going to be problematic. And these immersive formats, part of what they're trying to do is kind of solve that problem and end up with a smarter down mix that translates better.
Sure, yeah, makes sense. Mm-hmm. Aha, right. So I think so how does this differ, where does binaural come into all this? You have the HRTF, have this little fly here that I've taken care of. Awesome. So yeah, how does that come into it? Where does that sit in the process?
So binaural audio, it's interesting because it is considered an immersive format, right. Whereas stereo isn't. And binaural's been around for a long time. Right. I don't know exactly when it came about, but I remember being very young in college and seeing like the Neumann binaural head right. in a studio and doing some recordings and playing around with it. So binaural's been around for a long time, and it still remains probably the most common way people are going to actually hear immersive content. Traditionally, binaural audio was created by, you'd have to record with a very specialized microphone. And the thing I'm talking about, the Neumann head, it's literally like a rubber, upper torso, kind of neck, shoulders, head, and they put microphones in the dummy's ears. And then, so it's recording audio, but it's kind of bounced off of this dummy's, like their anatomy, and gone through their ear canals, kind of simulating the way a person would hear the world. And that was like kind of some of the earlier forms of binaural, was just recording it naturally in that format. Now you're more likely to hear binaural as an output, like a decoded output of an immersive mix. So there's this thing called HRTF, head-related transfer function. And that is like a system that, how does your brain localize audio? Well, one of the ways is through time of arrival distance. So if there's a sound off to your right, it's going to arrive at your right ear slightly before your left ear, and vice versa. Right. So it's a timing thing, but it's also a frequency thing. A lot of times, if a sound is originating behind you, that sound now has to go around your ear. Sure. Like the back of your ear is kind of blocking it a little bit. Right. And there's going to be a subtle reduction of high frequencies when that happens. So it's kind of the time of arrival, and it's also just kind of how your individual anatomy is interacting with that audio. And your brain basically builds up this profile of like, okay, this is what the sound sounds like when it's right in front of me. But what does it sound like when it's off to the left or the right or above me or behind me or below me for that matter? And, you know, there are a couple ways to do these HRTFs. The first thing they do is they basically come up with an average. You know, they send, you know, I don't know, 1,000 people into a studio and they play tones for them emanating from different places, and they kind of track their frequency response, and they say, okay, these 1,000 different people came in, let's just average all of their responses together.
Right.
And then so we have like this average human head-related transfer function. That may or may not work for everybody. I know, speaking for myself personally, I really struggle with binaural audio because it just doesn't translate well to me. And I don't know if it's something about my ears or whatever, that it doesn't work for me personally, but somebody else might listen to that exact same recording and be totally blown away by how immersive and natural sounding it was. So the other way of doing HRTF is to do it on a personal level. There is some software that you can upload. For example, there's a company called Genelec that makes speakers. And they're working on some HRTF stuff right now. And you literally, I think you take like 80 or 100 pictures of your head. Like on your phone, you just move it all around your head and take tons of pictures, and then you upload it. And they've got some AI that will now like look at all of those pictures and kind of design a custom, you know, frequency response that's for you based on the size and shape of your head and ears, and so on. So I haven't had the opportunity to try one of these personalized HRTFs yet, but the consensus is that it's pretty good. You know, for people that have struggled with it, I think are having better luck when they do some process like this. There's a few other softwares out there that are doing something like that. So that's something I'm really curious to try in the near future, to see how that all translates. So anyway, binaural audio. This is very common in game audio because, you know, in a video game, especially, you know, like a 3D game, you know, not some 2D platformer, but something that's truly three-dimensional, you might have, you know, adversaries behind you or above you and so on and so forth. So what it's going to do is it's going to take all of the audio that's being triggered by in-game actions, you know, whether that's you moving the character and walking and making footsteps, or the non-player characters moving around and the stuff that the sounds that they're triggering. And it's going to take all that, and based on the positioning of it within the game engine, it is going to apply that HRTF, that frequency response, to the sound, and then feed you, you know, an immersive binaural rendition of what was happening in the game engine. So, you know, many of you like playing video games. You have to have headphones on. That's another important thing. But if you've played a game with headphones on, you have probably experienced binaural audio and maybe didn't even realize that that's what was happening under the hood. And that's that kind of reminds me of another really important aspect of binaural is you really want it to be on headphones. You know, stereo audio, you can play on speakers.
Exactly, yeah.
And, you know, and you have like your phantom center, and you can, you know, if your speakers are set up properly, you get a really great stereo image. But binaural doesn't really hold up to that so well. You know, you're going to lose that, you know, everything's just going to sound like it's in front of you again. So you really need to have...
You're going to get really immersed into it.
Yeah, the headphones, you know, I think a good part of it is just blocking out outside sound and reflection and stuff like that, and just keeping it really contained is the best way to reproduce that.
I keep having we have a question on the stream, I believe.
That is correct. So Tanker Tom asked, how similar would mixing for VR be to mixing for Atmos?
Good question then.
Yeah. We're gonna get technical here, I guess. So mixing for VR, it's and you know, we have the game audio expert sitting here next to me. I'm more of a film audio mixer. But in game audio, which is probably what you're talking about in terms of VR, is probably a VR sort of gaming experience. Those sounds are happening in the game engine, which is kind of keeping track of where everything is in 3D space,
Sure.
right? So, if there's like a torch on the wall that's making a fire crackling sound in your dungeon, that is emitting from a fixed point. And then you, the player, you're wearing your VR headset and you're like, turning your head or you're looking this way or that way.
Right.
But that fixed point isn't changing. It's you that's changing.
Yes.
So it's not really being mixed per se in any sort of active way. Like the mix is kind of just unfolding in real time as you move your head around.
Very interactive experience,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, you can think of like the player is almost mixing the experience themselves.
That's right. That's a good way of looking at it, yeah.
At some point, an audio engineer, that worked on the game has decided, well, how loud is this thing going to be, and what is it going to sound like, and what sort of behavior is it going to exhibit?
Sure.
Like does it get quieter when you walk away from it, or does it get louder when you walk towards it?
Yeah, so the attenuation is going to be programmed with the middleware, right? So
Right.
basically that would determine how loud the sound is, and as opposed to how quiet the sound is, definitely.
Yeah. So a lot of that is kind of baked in and predetermined, and then the positioning or the panning, if you will, is all kind of controlled by the player in real time.
That's it. Yeah.
Whereas if I'm doing a film mix in Dolby Atmos, the screen is fixed. The screen is always going to be in front of you, right? And you, the mixer, you're always sitting in the middle of the room looking at the screen.
Yep.
So we have to much more actively, physically pan things with automation, fly these objects around the room. So I think that would probably be the biggest difference between.
Yeah, I think so. I think you nailed it there. Couldn't have said it any better myself.
Cool. Well, good question. Thank you.
Excellent. Yes, thank you. Keep them coming. I guess I don't know if you have anything to show us today. I mean, I know that this is available to people who have certain DAWs, right? You can actually use this. I know Pro Tools has it, Logic has it. I mean, it's an extra additional plug-in. I guess with Steinberg, with Nuendo, it comes with it, but Logic, it comes with it, but with Pro Tools, it's an extra thing that you have to purchase there.
Right.
Kind of put that in there.
Yeah. Pro Tools, Avid's always going to do things the hard way compared to everyone else, in my opinion. But
I didn't say that.
Yeah, but it is. I'm a Pro Tools. That's the only DAW I use, for the record. I love Pro Tools. But,
Yeah. So do
I reserve the right to rip on them. So yeah, it is. If you have a Pro Tools subscription, it's like an extra $100 to buy the plugin. They call it the Dolby Renderer, and it's actually, it would be incorrect to call it a plugin. It's a separate application that runs on the computer that kind of takes the audio from Pro Tools and then converts it into that immersive format.
Right.
There are a couple of ways to run the renderer. The most simple way is to just run the renderer on the same computer as your Pro Tools session.
Yeah.
For more advanced workflows, you might have a separate second computer that's totally dedicated to running the Dolby renderer. But that gets a little more complicated because you have to send 128 channels of audio back and forth between the two computers.
That's right.
So you need a really big interface with 256 channels worth of I/O
Sure.
to even pull that off. So for those of you, I know I'm talking to audio production students who are online, but if any of you are ever on campus, my email address has been on the screen this whole time. You can feel free to email me and
Sure.
set up a tour. We're building our first Dolby Atmos mix room on campus, and it should be complete very soon. And in that setup, we're running everything all on the same computer.
Right.
So Pro Tools and the renderer, we're kind of starting with a simplified setup, and then
Sure.
we might decide to add on it in the future, but we want to kind of start.
But I believe you've got like an M2 computer that's will handle that.
Yeah,
pretty
yeah,
well.
it's a new Mac Studio Ultra that can definitely handle not only a big Pro Tools session running, but also the renderer. So
Yeah, exactly.
your mileage may vary depending on your computer and its specs and stuff like that.
I did manage to get I checked it out the other day. Jason was nice enough, and Dave, were nice enough to show me that room and getting there, right, almost there.
Yeah, just a little bit of construction stuff to do, some cosmetic stuff. But yeah, I think we'll be mixing in Atmos on campus for the first time ever, pretty much,
Nice.
in a week or two.
Yeah, instead of a makeshift one that was before, right? We basically just put that together on the dub stage.
Right, right. Yeah, he's referring to, we did an Atmos mix on our dubbing stage, but because the speakers have to go above you, we basically, you can see probably on camera, there's some truss behind us. We actually built a cage out of truss and then hung speakers from the truss as sort of a temporary fix. But yeah, this will be the first time we've had a truly dedicated space to immersive mixing, which is very cool.
Nice. Very, very nice. Did you have anything to show us today, or did you something on the screen, for example, or were we just kind of discussing it? I never did.
Yeah, I mean, I brought a visual aid that could help. We keep talking about all these different formats of like stereo, 5.1, 7.1, Atmos. So I do have a little graphic prepared that just kind of illustrates the difference between some of these common formats. From a like speaker count perspective, just so you can start to see as these, you go from stereo on up, that there's more and more and more speakers. Yeah, so let's take a minute to talk about some of that stuff.
I'd be intrigued myself here.
Okay, so stereo, probably everybody is pretty familiar with, and again, I work in film audio. I'm an audio post mixer, so I'm going to always be referencing like film and television as opposed to music. I'm a music fan first, but now I do sound for film for a living. So we're going to kind of look at it through that lens.
That makes a difference.
So the first drawing I have is just kind of illustrating what stereo is, and most people should be familiar with this. It's two channels, left and right. And this is kind of represented by like what most people have in a standard television or in a laptop or headphones for that matter. So the vast majority of film and TV and music content is consumed in stereo.
Sure.
Even now, even though these immersive formats are taking off, the vast majority of the world is listening to things in stereo.
Absolutely.
So that's pretty simple. Everybody should be kind of familiar with that. So now we're getting into the surround sound formats, and things get a little bit more complicated. 5.1 is probably the next most common surround format. And this is what you're going to find in a lot of people's home theaters. If you have like a living room where you've bought a sound bar and a couple of satellite speakers, or have like an AV receiver and speakers all around the room, it's probably going to be 5.1. And here, there are two numbers we have to talk about, 5 and 0.1. Right, so the first number, the 5, is how many speakers are around you on the horizontal plane. So in this case, there are 5. There are 3 in front of you. You have your left and your right, just like in stereo. But we've added a center channel now. And this was an innovation that came about because they wanted to be able to reproduce dialogue in a movie theater through its own speaker, so that it wasn't having to compete with the music and the sound effects and the other elements of what we would have in a film mix.
And initially this was LCRS, right? The first type.
Right.
And it went from there to 5.1.
Yeah, which I guess, was LCRS meant like a primitive 4.1, I guess we could call it.
Yes, you could say that.
Yeah, so we have this center channel that is really primarily for your dialogue, to keep it kind of isolated and intelligible, compared to the other sounds. Then you have a left and right surround, and those are speakers that are behind the listener. So now your film mixer has the ability to start to bring sounds back into the room and even place them directly behind the viewer, which would be really cool in, a horror movie or something like that. If you want, somebody to all of a sudden be whispering behind you, you can do that in the mix now with 5.1. So that's our 5. And then the 0.1 is the subwoofer or the LFE channel. So the subwoofer is that, if you're not familiar, it only reproduces very low frequencies. And if you're at the movie theater watching a movie, it's what's really going to like get the room rumbling and make your seat vibrate. So when you see 0.1 or point any number, that's referring to the number of subwoofers in the setup. So that's our 5.1.
Just to interrupt you, just real briefly, we have a question in the chat, I believe.
Yeah, fire away.
So one of our viewers is asking, what is the major difference between Atmos and Apple spatial audio?
Oh, okay.
question.
So yeah, that's a good question. It's pretty much one and the same, actually. What Apple spatial is when, like, if you mix an album in an immersive format, what Apple Music wants you to deliver is a Dolby Atmos deliverable.
Right.
It's a file called an ADM, a .adm, which is a basically it's all of the sounds for your film and all of the panning, the XYZ coordinate panning information, metadata, all in one big file.
Sure.
That represents everything. And then that's what you hand in to Apple. And then Apple does some proprietary stuff to that Atmos mix to make their spatial audio, like their Apple spatial audio. I don't know exactly what they're doing. I suspect that it's using something called ambisonic.
Okay.
Ambisonic is kind of like binaural. It's an older format that has the capability to give head tracking of audio. So that's, I think what they're doing is they're taking the Dolby Atmos mix and then they're like decoding that down to ambisonic, which is a 4-channel audio format, and it retains that head tracking ability, which is something that their AirPods are offering. You know, that if you're listening to the song and you tilt your head one way or the other, the sound field could kind of shift a little bit. That's part of the gimmick of, you know, why they want you to buy those AirPods.
Sure.
And yeah, so it's that spatial audio is derived from a Dolby Atmos mix. So they're kind of one and the same, but Apple's doing some technological magic to just kind of spice it up a little bit.
Okay. Great question.
Yeah.
Thank you, friends.
Good stuff.
So
All right,
we're talking about surround then.
Yeah.
And then we're going on to the next
So
format.
7.1, not really moving the needle too much. Most movie theaters in the US are going to be in 7.1. It's exactly like 5.1, except there's 2 additional speakers on the sides. So you have a higher resolution as you're moving things to the back of the room.
Right.
You have another speaker you can stop in, you know, so it's not having to jump from the front of the room to the back. It has a middle speaker. And then, so now this is the game changer. Here is our Dolby Atmos minimum spec. So this amount of speakers is the least you can have and be considered Dolby Atmos compatible. So this is 7.1.4. So 7.1, exactly like we just saw.
Yeah.
The 7 being the number of speakers that are around you on the horizontal plane. The 1 being how many subwoofers are there. And the 0.4, the third digit, is referring to how many speakers are on the ceiling, what we call the height channels. So in the minimum setup, you have to have 4 speakers mounted on your ceiling. And it's a front left and right and a rear left and right. So you basically have like a separate quad setup up on the ceiling. So this is how we're getting that height information. You know, we talked about how height or verticality was one of the main, you know, factors that determine whether something was immersive or not. And that's how we're accomplishing this on a speaker setup. Now, 7.1.4 is the minimum. It can go up from there. We've had conversations about upgrading our dub stage here on campus to Dolby Atmos, and we talked about 9.2.6. So 9 speakers around you, 2 channels of subs, and 6 speakers on the ceiling. You know, or you can just get silly with it. You know, you could do like 11.4.16. I don't know, like, you know, come up with a number, and it should support it. You know, so if you go to a Dolby Atmos compatible movie theater and you look around and you start counting the speakers, you're going to realize it's some really high number, probably. So this is kind of a starting point.
Do you think you'll get the same experience if the higher the speaker count? So that's just saying the correlation between 5.1 and 7.1, maybe that a little bit better experience.
I think, you know, the difference between 7.1.4 and 9.1.6 is probably pretty big, but then there probably starts to be diminishing returns. You know, like if you threw 100 speakers at it, it's really not going to sound that much different than if you had 80 speakers, let's say.
Sure.
You know, just throwing crazy numbers out there. But yeah, I mean, of course, people who sell speakers are going to tell you, oh, the more speakers you have, the better the resolution and the locality of the sounds, but they're trying to sell you speakers too,
Yes.
so you have to take that with a grain of salt. I personally have only ever, I'm touching my lav mic, I'm committing audio sins here. I've only mixed in 714. I've never mixed in a format any larger than that, so I can't speak to that personally. But yeah, talking to people at Dolby, they kind of said 916 is kind of a sweet spot for them. Like that's the way they would set up their studios, to get the best trade-off of like number of speakers versus, level of immersiveness. So, the unfortunate thing is, of course, when you're talking about this many speakers, it is a barrier to entry. If you want to be mixing this content on speakers, not only do you have to have a minimum of 12 speakers, but you have to have a room big enough to put them in.
Yes.
And you have to have an interface that has that many outputs. And you have to have a monitor controller that can control that many speakers. And, and it kind of goes on and on and on.
Yeah.
So it is kind of a barrier to entry. So that's why, especially for students, I think the majority of people, their initial kind of dipping into immersive formats will be over headphones. But I think the hope is there that, if you kind of dip your toe in on the headphones and then maybe you start buying some speakers and you're kind of working your way up to something a little bit more elaborate.
Sure.
Over time.
Sure. I guess it's almost like 3:40. I guess.
Yeah, it is.
We've
Yeah,
got,
so
we
we
got
somehow
through some good stuff here.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you, what's the most exciting thing you've read recently or heard about that you'd like to try out? I guess as far as getting into this a bit more, get something a bit different.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much cool stuff happening right now. I mean, this is an emerging technology, and it's really neat to kind of see, like, literally almost every day there's some new product or software or idea out there in regards to immersive audio. For me personally, I'm definitely a synth nerd. There's a new plugin. There's a company called Sound Particles, and they're making this virtual instrument called Skydust, which is an immersive synthesizer. Yeah. So you have multiple synth voices and big polyphony, and you can program this thing in a number of ways. But one way, every key you touch can come out of a different speaker. Or like your automation, if you're doing a filter sweep, that filter sweep can go from top to bottom of the room or front to back of the room. So this is something, I've been super busy lately, and I bought the plugin and it's just sitting in my iLock uninstalled because I was just so excited to have it. But I haven't had
pretty familiar with me, actually. For those people who know me, that's kind of a kind of familiar thing.
Yeah, gear acquisition syndrome, software acquisition syndrome in this case.
Absolutely. Awesome, that's awesome. I think I have to check it out as well, for sure, but hopefully I'll get to use it some way, shape or form. I don't know if we have any other questions that are, because we're kind of wrapping up, I guess, we've got about 4 minutes or so. No questions, so what do you think is the last parting shot, I guess, that we have a bit of knowledge for our students here around listening?
Yeah, I guess a good parting shot would be just like, be as curious as you can be.
Yeah.
Because this is all so new that you're not behind. For a long time, I feel like as a student, people felt like, there have been professionals doing this for 30 years. Surround sound's been around for 50 years.
We're not late to the party.
Yeah, like how are we going to catch up to these people? When it comes to immersive audio, you're not late to the party. Like you can jump in now and make mistakes and break stuff and innovate, and it's a really cool space. I think for people that are new to the industry, this maybe is an opportunity for you to kind of put your fingerprint on the industry. So definitely follow up on it and stay in touch with everything that's happening, because you never know.
Yeah, and there's definitely no excuse for our students that have in their launch box. You obviously have Logic that you can at least dip your toe into this. Don't wait until you get to a class that's probably going to be teaching it, but just at least get to try it out. And I know that that's very, very important to start to immerse yourself in, pardon the pun, but
Yeah, absolutely. And that hands-on and really, for me, and I'm sure a lot of people are this way, like I learn from making mistakes.
Yeah.
So get in there and screw it up. And,
Exactly.
and that's really where you're going to get that valuable learning experience.
Definitely, because I mean, the best place to do it is while you're learning, right here, and not doing it out in the real world. You've polished all those mistakes that you've done here. So
Yeah.
awesome.
Right.
Did we have it? Oh, okay.
Oh, did we get a question?
I don't know. I don't think we did, right?
Oh, I got all excited.
A finishing statement. Okay, great. So it's our time. Thank you very much today. Remember that the AP Town Hall is the last Monday of every month. So it's something that happens every month. We usually have a different guest every month, and sometimes a different presenter, like myself. I apologize that I didn't do too bad of a job today. But a big thank you to our show production students and the Audiovisual Technologies class and their course director, John Coast, for handling all the behind the scenes today. So thank you all. Great job, team. Round of applause for you guys. And thank you all for joining. And hopefully we'll see you next time. And if you can't catch this now, just make sure you check it out on our YouTube channel to see the archives.
Thank you.
Have a great day. Thank you very much, Jason.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Take care.